Hello, welcome back to another video, I guess tutorial video to be specific with another explanation. Somebody requested a video on how to use the adjustment layer curves and also how to deal with lighting on kingdom stages because we all know Mnet's a shitty company, but their lighting is even shittier if that's possible. So short disclaimer, I normally give Stray Kids stages, and that's pretty much it. But I didn't want to just do that for this, so I downloaded and did some color correction stuff for the boys stage. I think for their Red Wedding, it was their most recent stage. ATEEZ's second stage, where Jungkook kind of looked like a Cheeto, and the last iKON stage, where I don't know the members of iKON, but this guy, where they gave him very magenta lighting. But I figure I'd do these three because they do kind of show like there's a lot of blue lighting stages like these that aren't really too bad to fix, and there are some like these that are terrible to fix. So I figured we'd do a couple of examples. So I normally also work with blue gifts a lot. As far as correcting, I find them like the easiest compared to especially like yellow and the magenta that we'll go over in a little bit. So we'll just start with this, and I'm also just going to keep this PSD in here. As you see, there's not a whole lot of adjustment layers. But I'm just going to start with this one just because it's pretty simple, and there's also not super harsh lighting. There are some scenes from Kingdom stages that are just too far gone to try and fix. This one's almost there, mainly because his face is almost like one shade of magenta. At least with like Changmin's face here, it's not just blue. There's some like palish blue colors. Like it's pretty salvageable. But this is by like I think this was just kind of luck, but that's fine. We're getting ahead of ourselves. Going back to this, for these types of stages, I always start with a curves layer, and I'll go into a little bit further of how I kind of deal with things like this with the curves layer, a little bit more in depth than I have in the past, just because it was part of like the request. But yeah, depending on the lighting, I usually start with the RBG here, and then go into the specific colors in a little bit. But with RGB, it just you pull the curve up, it brightens it. It essentially is like a brightness and curve layer. It controls the reds, the greens, and the blues all at once. So for this one, I'll brighten it up just a little bit, and then I usually tackle either the reds or the blues first. I don't normally touch the greens, but in some cases I do. I don't think I did in this case, but I usually start with the color that's most prominent in the scene. So if it was like a really red GIF, then I would start with and adjust the reds first, but since this one's really blue, I'll start with the blue. And now with the blue, since you're just controlling at itself, if you pull it down, it obviously takes the blues away and replaces it with a more yellow color, and if you take it up, then it's more blue. And then the further you go into the top right corner or wherever these sliders are white, sometimes they're reversed. I don't know why they're reversed sometimes, but sometimes they are. You can move the endpoints. Here, I'm going to take this off. You can move the endpoint. So obviously, if you move the blues over to the left, it brings more blues in the highlights. And if you move the curve to the left or like towards the white arrow, then where it goes below this line, it takes it away. But for this, since it is pretty blue, we'll take it down. We'll also take it down a little bit. This side mainly controls the highlights. This side mainly controls the shadows. That's pretty intuitive if you used Photoshop before. So we have that, and so that takes out a lot of the blues. So it kind of neutralizes, I guess, his skin a little bit. So he kind of looks like a vampire, but we'll be adding color back into his skin. So the same. So as far as like the red and the greens, I work the similar way to the blue, but for if you take down the red curve, then it replaces it with a blue. If you take up the red curve, it obviously replaces it with red. And then with green, if you take it down, it's replaced with red. And if you take it up, it's replaced. It obviously highlights the greens, but I just wanted to stick that in there. Hold on, we don't want to mess with the greens. But going back to the reds, I did want to bump up the reds, so you would put the curve up. And there's also the highlights are still fairly blue, so I usually like drag the reds over a little bit. It doesn't always work that well, but as you can see, there's still like there's a pretty big difference from where we started. And then there's also some greens in the shadows of his hair, which we can take care of now. So I'm just gonna take the black, or like the bottom left arrow, and take it in just a little bit. So then those greens that were in the shadows of his hair are a little bit closer to a neutral color. If the greens were in the highlight, then we would take it down here, but there it is. So with just one adjustment layer, we've made a pretty big difference already. And then next I usually finish it off with a levels layer. It's similar to the curves, but I guess it's less like you're less likely to get like super precise with it. I don't know why I do level second, but that's just the way I've done it. It's worked. But as far as like if you take the arrows to the right, it becomes like the opposite color. I think that made sense, but it works similar to the wave curves at least. But as you can see, with two levels, we've pretty much like completely changed his skin tone. What else? And then and then for this we'll just have some like selective color, play around with it. Usually with these I try to play around with the whites a little bit. Try and fill those in. You can go to reds. Then sometimes I also mess with the neutrals just a little bit. Usually nothing too extreme, just to get something like nudged in the right direction. There we go. Yeah, it just takes some tinkering. I think this is even like a different coloring from what I just did. Yeah, but it just takes some tinkering now and again. But again, like this isn't. I never go in with a plan. I just kind of go with it. I guess it really does just take practice, because after a while you will be able to identify scenes that you can and cannot GIF, and kind of what order will work for you as far as of working through these types of layers. I'm too late. I usually put a fill layer. It's just a preference of mine not have blacks completely black. We'll just say that's good enough. I still think that's different from what I had originally. That's why I guess like the hardest thing with this, yeah, it's a little bit brighter, skin's a little bit paler, but that's okay. We can just go with this. It's a lot better than what we started with, but yeah, I just never really go with the plan. I just hope for the best. Oh well. We'll say that's good enough. There we go. Changmin is no longer a blueberry. And you can see again like the stark contrast between the two sides of what we started with and then what we ended up with. But yeah, but this one was like a simpler one. And as you can see, there were again like multiple ways to do it. Though the ending was a little bit similar as far as like what you ended up with. One is just a little bit more red, but yep. So then with that, we can move on to the next one, this Jungle here. And the beginning one, he's belting out his high note at the end of Wonderland. But I don't know why they decided to make ATs look like Cheetos during most of this. Okay, joke's on me. This stage I tried to recreate it as I was doing some commentary, but for some reason, like, I could only create that one coloring once. But the process is essentially still the same as far as like how the tools are used and how it's worked. So again, for this one, so I'll just explain kind of like the reasoning behind like the order of layers and everything. So again, we'll start with curves, as it is the kind of base kind of adjustment layer. And so we're gonna change Cheeto Jungle here to something a little bit less Cheeto-y. So I brought the shadows up a little bit to create more contrast in his face, as the more contrast or shadows and highlights somebody has on their face, the easier it is to salvage, that sort of thing. And then going to the reds first. Well, I brought down the reds in the highlights, as there were a lot of reds on his face, and also brought it down in the shadows, and then also just a little bit overall, just to help so the reds aren't quite as vibrant. And then the greens are pretty much essentially the same. And then with blues, I brought that up because, as you remember, when you bring down a blue curve, it adds yellows to it, to the scene. So we'll want to bring the blue curve up so it takes yellows out and replaces them more with blues. And then that one's actually flipped on accident. And then we'll go to levels. So RGB being a little bit brighter. Reds weren't really touched. Greens were brought down a little, or brought up a little bit actually. And then there were a fair amount of blue changes. Yeah, okay. And then for the selective color, reds are changed, magentas were brought up a little bit, so he's a little bit more red and a little less yellow, and the yellows were brought down and the reds a little bit. And then the yellows, trying to cancel out that, again, kind of Cheeto color, brought up the cyans, because again, that helps cancel out the yellows, brought down the magenta and the yellow itself, and brought up blacks a little bit. I think that might have been it for this. Yeah, sometimes neutrals are changed. I decided not to in this one with the color balance layer, but sometimes neutrals are used. Though, if you do want to use them for a selective color, use them sparingly, or use a little bit through a couple of layers along with other adjustments, because if you go a little bit too extreme, it can make things a little nutty, like that. Like, you don't really want that, so use the neutrals with caution, that's all I gotta say. And then for this one, it was bad enough where I did use a layer for color balance. I haven't used color balance in a long while. Since I learned how to use the curves layer, I pretty much just switched to that. But for as far as this tool, I'll create a new layer and then delete it later. So I don't know how many people have used this, but it is a fairly self-explanatory tool. So they have, for the adjustments you can do, is for the midtone, shadows, and highlights. Fairly self-explanatory as far as like what that is in a picture. But again, you can either make things more like cyan or more red. So like in this case, you probably want a little bit more on the cyan side. And then you can make it more magenta or green. You can put a little bit more on the magenta side, and then you can make it more blue or yellow. We can just leave that there for now, I guess. And then you can do the same thing with shadows if you want. All that kind of good stuff. And then highlights as well. Color balance is a pretty like helpful tool in a lot of cases, especially if you have, again, like terrible lighting like this. But yeah, so that's the color balance layer. And then also, it was also kind of bad enough to where hue and saturation layer is used. I usually use hue and saturation for some of the recent coloring styles or black and white GIFs. Bring everything down and then just bump up the reds and yellows. So then it's just the skin tones that are brought out, and then the background is black and white, obviously. But in this case, sometimes, again, if things are really bad, change the saturation, the lightness, and the hue a little bit of the reds and yellows, so it kind of like mutes the skin tone just a little bit, just so you can like see it. So he's a little bit more red, but not as saturated, and a little bit lighter. It doesn't look quite as bad. It also helps match some of the yellows to the reds, so it doesn't look quite as drastic. But it's some minor adjustments, but it really does help. But there's that, and then again, for like a stylistic thing, I don't like to have the blacks on there. I like to have a little bit of an offset black, so I just do a color fill layer. You can do it from here, or you can go to layer, new filler, or solid color, and then do it that way. Yeah, but now Jungho doesn't really look like a Cheeto and looks more like a normal human. And then going on to the next one, I think I'm gonna treat it like the same way I just did with Jungho, because this was a mess of a one, and it was just a lot of tiny adjustments here and there to try and get it to this stage from this magenta one. So we can go through, as you can see, through the various selected color layers and everything, and even a second curves layer. So we'll just go layer by layer, and I'll explain how things were created. So for this one, you have this member of Icon where a lot of things are blue, and his skin is very, very magenta. Don't know why they chose this lighting, but they did. So once again, it is very bright, and I wanted a little bit more contrast to his skin before even trying to get it semi-looking correct. So we have go to the RGB, bring out the shadows a little bit more like we did before, and then reds, bring down the reds a little bit. There wasn't much you could do because there's not a magenta curve. It just takes some finagling here and there, but bring down the reds a little bit. Bring up the greens a lot to help cancel out some of those reds. Like, it didn't help that much, but it did a little bit. It helped eliminate some of the reds that were in the lighting above his head. And then also bring down the blues, because the reds and the blues kind of control the magenta, because it's kind of in the middle of what's controlled by the red curve and what's controlled by the blue curve. So you kind of like have to work with those two in tandem. And then going to the levels, I know it looks bad right now, but it'll be better, obviously, as you saw the end result. So for this, going to the levels, bringing up the shadows again. Reds weren't touched, or they weren't touched that much. Greens were brought up to help combat the reds. And then blues were brought up a little bit to help, I'm not sure why, but I think some of these layers help like cancel out older ones. This is just how I color things. I was like, oh, I just need to do this, this, and this. It's always a mess. It never makes sense. So I'm sorry if this video is very confusing. But again, with the reds, want to try to take out as much red as possible to bring in more yellow. There's not any yellows to actually adjust. This was just for a preference in the background. So this layer also helped his jacket become more purple rather than blue, because that blue was a little too harsh for me. So I just brought down the blues in the cyans and blues in the selective color layer. And that was all that was touched there. And so this is where you can see there's a larger change from the previous selective color layer. I think this is where neutrals were involved. Yeah, so yellows are brought up in the neutrals. This is what I was talking about. Usually doesn't go this extreme, but in this case it did have to work that way. A little bit, take down a little bit with the cyans, a little bit with the magentas. And then also the biggest change is obviously the magenta, really kicking up those yellows. So it looks a little bit less stark of a magenta, and then bringing down the magentas and up the cyans as well to help cancel out those reds a little bit. And then actually adding another curves layer, because we had a little bit more like manageable skin tone from where we were before. So we were able to, so I added another curves layer to try and make some more drastic changes from a better base kind of skin tone, if that made sense. So it was mainly reds and blues that were changed. So reds were taken down a little bit, and then so were blues, because again, those kind of control the magenta colors when it comes to scenes. So it looks a lot more like yellow and less magenta-y. But then also, again, like, I guess one bad thing is if you don't like greens and backgrounds, this kind of method that I use does bring out greens and backgrounds a lot. But you can try and like combat that a little bit in some selective color layers. But now it's some finer details as far as trying to get the skin tones matched. But I think this one again was more for the jacket itself. As you see, like the cyans and yellows and stuff were changed. I don't think anything else was changed besides the reds a little bit. And then another selective color layer with the yellows to bring out more yellow in his skin. And then again bringing up the cyans a little bit to help bring down the bring down the reds in his skin, but also I get if you wanted to try and do it this way, it makes the skin too yellow. So that's like kind of one thing that I do on certain scenes. If I want to have like less of one color in it without making it more vibrant, I usually bump up the opposite color or the color that combats it. I know this is a little bit rambly, but I swear I'm trying to get a point across. So for this, like again, like the cyans combat the reds. For magenta, you would probably bump up the yellows and take down the magenta, and then for the yellows, you would up the magenta and the cyan probably a little bit to help try and combat that. Something similar to that. And then once again, going to the hue and saturation, similar to the general gift that we went over earlier, to change the actual hue of the reds just a little bit, and the lightness a little bit and the saturation a little bit. I think also the magentas were changed. No, just the reds. So it's just that. So his skin isn't quite as like vibrant as before, and then just one last there you go. And then one last kind of adjustment with the neutrals. With the yellows bumped up more, so his skin is obviously like a little bit less magenta, and it's closer-ish to what a human skin actually looks like. Yeah, I will say though, because there are so many like fine adjustments specifically to these scenes, they might require, or each GIF, even if it's from the same video, a different PSD every time. And sometimes even like within one GIF, the lighting is enough to where you might need to change it. Yeah, just because again, like it's so specialized to those like couple of frames, like with that one spotlight. So there is a fair amount of finagling when it comes to extreme scenes like this one. With the the Changmin one from earlier, with the other ending fairies for this stage, you could probably get away with just like flopping this coloring onto those and call it a day. Yeah, you might be able to get away with some of the other yellow scenes on ATEEZ's stage with the coloring from like the Jungho scene, but it's not guaranteed. But yeah, I think that's like everything. I'm sorry if I only really like showed how I did it live with the Changmin one. It's just I don't think I'd be able to recreate these if I tried, because I did try with the Jungho one, it just didn't work out. But hopefully this was like somewhat helpful, and at least like talking through like why I did use like certain adjustment layers in certain cases helped. If not, or you need more explanation on things, or want like a certain stage, like see how I would approach it, please just let me know. But I hope this helped a couple of you, and I will see you all in the next video.